Good afternoon to all our virtual attendees, and I hope you're sitting comfortably wherever you are. Today I'm going to discuss the increased financial risk from the global COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Andrew Cushion, Managing Director of Twice2Much. I founded Twice2Much in 2003 and we specialise in spend recovery auditing, identifying overpayments and working in partnership with organisations to recover money back for them. Over the last 18 years we have worked with many organisations both in the public and private sector, reviewing millions of invoices, and to date have been successful in recovering in excess of £140 million on their behalf. We provide the time, resource and expertise that many in-house teams cannot justify resourcing internally. Today's presentation will look at the increased financial risk facing organisations as a result of the pandemic. It will consider how organisations may look to give themselves assurance that these risks haven't happened to them, and if so, what can be done to 1. Quantify any costs incurred as a result, i.e. overpayments, and 2. How these might be recovered. Firstly, we will look at the background and challenges faced during the last year or so. Next, I will go through some examples of increased risks around payments to suppliers during this pandemic. Following on from this, I will outline how the CCS government framework on spend recovery has been adjusted by way of a variation and approved by the Cabinet Office to enable all public sector organisations to obtain assurance by way of a third-party review of their spend during the pandemic period specifically. The focus here is on ensuring that the appropriate mix of expertise and resources are used to find, confirm and resolve any issues that might have occurred during this period. Obviously, this only addresses payments to suppliers. Following this, I will look at who should procure from two perspectives: what organisations should procure, and who within the organisation are the best people to procure this service. I will then outline what a review might look like in practice. Finally, I will finish with why these reviews should be considered now and take any questions at the end. Having now presented and viewed a number of presentations within this COVID virtual world, addressing the challenge of the internet has meant that this presentation has been pre-recorded. However, I will be online, subject to the internet, fingers crossed, and therefore will be happy to receive any questions via the platform both during my presentation and afterwards, which I can address immediately or equally answer any of your questions arising during the Q&A session. So please do not hesitate to ask any questions as they pop up. So firstly, background and challenges. COVID-19 created a situation that required the UK public sector to rapidly source goods and services, sometimes in high volumes and occasionally from previously unused suppliers. Additional pressures were also brought to bear by unfamiliar home working practices, and in many cases there was a need across the public sector to support financially struggling supply chains. All of these factors together make public sector commercial activity for this period uniquely different from what would be considered business as usual.
Please leave your number and a message, and we'll return your call as soon as possible.
Whilst furlough may not have had the same direct impact within the public sector, the impact of sick leave is still applicable, and just as important has been the impact of furlough on the day-to-day relationships with suppliers. I trust that a number of the examples here are only too recognisable during our current lockdown, especially. But I would like to assure you that I was not the man used in the video clip. I am sure that at some time most of us have experienced these issues, and whilst team meetings etc. have been very useful to keep in touch and to communicate, they have at times been very challenging in their own right. Clearly, one of the main challenges has been the changes in processes or workflow, which potentially creates greater risk of the same invoices being authorised by different managers. Along with different processes for scanning and inputting of invoices, it has significantly increased the risk around error payments to suppliers.
All operators are busy at this time. Please hold.
Particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge urgency to procure PPE to protect our staff. As a result, demand was far in excess of supply, with the inevitable impact on cost. However, are you paying the same price now for your PPE as you were at the beginning of the pandemic? Along with the race to procure urgent supplies came the need for payment up front, predominantly from credit cards, but also in the form of pro forma invoices. How did your organisation deal with this challenge? As already highlighted, remote working has represented a significant challenge to most organisations, and I'm sure that we won't know the full cost or impact of remote working for a number of years to come, if at all. In addition to this, we have seen organisations trying to address the working from home, reduced office numbers in some way, and this has naturally led to increased risks of invoices being misprocessed. I will go through some real examples of misprocessed invoices shortly, and this is only exacerbated during the pandemic as different people take on additional responsibilities to cover furlough and sickness. As with the first set of risks, organisations have had to change, often significantly, who should or can authorise invoices, and often even more importantly, what information has been made available to them when authorising invoices for payment. Traditionally in organisations, invoices may move around the business from desk to desk, receiving the appropriate authorisation and then finally making their way back to accounts payable for payment. With remote working, many of these processes have had to change with associated risks. I'm sure that we can all appreciate how significant the pressure on resources has been for all of us. The unknown is how this has truly impacted on each and every organisation. The key control mechanisms in most organisations is that managers have a budget, and therefore if overpayments occurred, it would potentially be visible to managers, especially when comparing their budgets against their spend. However, COVID-related spend never had a budget. And finally, lack of visibility. In the many years of undertaking spend recoveries review and identifying and recovering overpayments to suppliers, one of the key elements is that most recoveries were never visible to clients in the first place. With all of the other issues faced during this pandemic, it is now even less likely that overpayments would be discovered, and even more the case that suppliers experiencing cash flow issues themselves would not highlight or refund payments as previously. I now want to share with you some actual examples that we have come across during our recent reviews, particularly covering the period of the pandemic, that I feel are likely to be occurring in most organisations across the country and no doubt worldwide. However, hopefully these examples will provide some food for thought for you to share with your colleagues and consider from a practical point of view how they may be identified within your present controls and processes, or help you in considering the benefit of utilising this framework that I'll shortly be covering in more detail. This diagram shows examples of different types of error and overpayments, which we'll go through specifically now. This specific example highlights the risk of overpayment when a supplier raises two completely different invoices, albeit virtually with the same invoice number, via two divisions of its business. As a result, the invoices were processed by the accounts payable team as normal on receipt of them. This is particularly applicable during the pandemic, when businesses have transferred responsibilities between group companies during the periods of furlough. This example is pertinent given that the items purchased were in fact face masks. The identification and keying of zeros and O's is one of the most common errors anyway pre-COVID. But this has no doubt become even more prevalent as a greater number of staff are involved in the process, helping out with processing and with the additional challenges of working from home and scanning. Similarly to the last example, the identification and keying of ones and I's has been a common error that cannot be picked up easily within most controls of the finance systems. Errors in keying like this mean that from a system point of view, they are treated as different invoices and therefore not identified as potential duplicates. Again, the challenges of working from home, trying to key invoices from bad quality images, increases the likelihood of these types of errors being made. The introduction of scanning in many organisations over the last few years has clearly led to savings in processing costs. However, scanning is obviously significantly dependent on the quality of the invoices provided by suppliers. Only too often do poor quality invoices lead to resultant errors in how the invoice number will appear in the finance system. With COVID-19, the sharing of responsibilities, often with reduced staffing levels in offices, has led to an increase in the risks around the same invoices being scanned or manually keyed with differing results. The example shown here demonstrates that a simple misscan can result in a supplier being unable to identify the correct invoice number and accordingly chasing for payment for the apparently unpaid invoice. I think that we all appreciate that with the present distractions, particularly with the challenges of working from home, it can have an impact on concentration. And this can lead to an increased likelihood of input or error. This is not to say that these types of errors would not have happened previously. but many of these instances would simply not have occurred within the normal office environment. Finally, the challenge can often be identifying what the supplier's actual invoice number is, and this has always been a challenge, especially within the public sector environment where there is more purchasing of services as opposed to product or stock items. In our experience working with councils and the NHS, there is a greater prevalence of narrative invoices rather than actual invoice numbers, and this can lead to an increased risk of duplicates. So with regard to obtaining assurance, I'd like to now look at the framework agreement. For a number of years, a framework has been in place established by Crown Commercial Services to enable public sector organisations to procure, spend analysis and recovery services. This is affectionately known as RM3820. However, this framework, like many frameworks you are likely to have come across, often involves a significant amount of internal resource and time. You'll also appreciate a significant amount of resource and time from our perspective as well. You will all appreciate at the moment we do not have that level of resource and or time. So to repeat, COVID-19 created a situation that required the UK public sector to rapidly source goods and services, sometimes in high volumes and occasionally from previously unused suppliers. In addition, there were significant changes in working practices that we have already addressed, creating increased risks of overpayments and or fraud by suppliers. So as a result, a variation was agreed with the Cabinet Office. Accordingly, Crown Commercial Services utilised the Spend Analysis and Recovery Services framework as a route to market for public sector organisations that wish to review their COVID-19 related spend in order to identify instances of suspected fraudulent activity or erroneous payments to third-party suppliers. This variation was agreed by the Cabinet Office in November 2020. We will look at how this variation can be used in practice, enabling organisations to procure an audit of their invoices and transactions. So firstly, the scope and scale of the review and what is or is not COVID-19 related spend will be up to the individual public sector organisation themselves and therefore will not be specifically defined. This gives you a higher degree of flexibility regarding the scope. A 10-day review has now been established. This variation enables a limited fixed cost review focused on reviewing the COVID-19 period, and I'll be explaining in more detail later how we could see this review working in practice. It is appreciated that there are limited internal resources available to either undertake reviews of this type or in assisting third parties to carry out such a review. By limiting the review in terms of both scope and time, the requirement for internal resources can be significantly reduced. If there are any issues, the earlier they can be identified, the quicker a solution can be implemented and potentially money saved. This compares favourably against the much longer historical procurement process for the full framework agreement. This simply enables you to procure from any of the suppliers listed on the framework via direct award. It represents a legally compliant route to market via the framework agreement variation. All organisations without doubt are going to be under significant pressure both now and for some time to come. The use of resources, both internal and external, to identify and address any issues should be appropriate and effective. Clearly, both the Cabinet Office and Crown Commercial Services appreciate via this variation to the agreement that they recognise that there are significant additional risks faced as a result of the pandemic, and that they need to facilitate organisations to utilise third-party experts to provide support to their own internal resources, ensuring the most cost-effective and efficient solution. So firstly, who should procure? Very few organisations will be unique in experiencing the challenges discussed today, but there is a way forward in sharing experiences and identifying best practice solutions together. Therefore, all organisations should really consider how they are looking to obtain assurance that their COVID-19 spend with suppliers has not been impacted by the risks discussed today. Who in the organisation should procure this type of review is probably the biggest challenge. Sharing our experience, traditionally there has been a belief that in order to procure this type of service, procurement need to go through an often extensive tender process with the inevitable resource costs and timescales involved. In reality, in the private sector, it is the following individuals that need to make the decision, as they are ultimately responsible for controls. Apologies. Apologies about that. In reality, in the private sector, as I said, the following individuals that are required to make these decisions. There is no reason why the same rationale does not apply in the public sector, especially now that the variation enables a low fixed cost of procurement and facilitates direct award to those already approved suppliers on the framework. I'll now go back to the slide I should have done before. To illustrate how this variation might work in practice, we have established what we call a health check, designed to achieve the objectives of the variation in the 10 days stated and providing the maximum benefit to clients with the minimum need for resource and their valuable time. We have extensive experience assisting clients with data extraction. All data is validated by us to ensure completeness and accuracy prior to any analysis being performed. The data period is reduced for these health checks to a maximum of 2 years, enabling identification of issues during the COVID-19 period, but also helping with comparisons of spend both pre and during the pandemic. The review side of the health check is probably the most important in that clients can benefit from the experience of specialists in this field, along with the analytical expertise and technological resources used to analyse client transactions. These reviews are performed off-system, off-site and out of site, enabling clients to continue focusing on the provision of their core services. Results can then be validated and finally confirmed. Key to any reviews of this type are the results, along with identifying potential overpayments and highlighting the types of errors occurring. Best practice solutions can be recommended to enable future risks to be mitigated. There are also recommendations regarding next steps with regards to a more in-depth review and the complete collection and recovery process as necessary. This is an addition to most reviews performed, but one we feel is particularly important during this current pandemic. As we are all aware, at the beginning of the pandemic there was an urgent need to procure PPE. There is now a need to look back and establish improved control over recent contracts and consider whether current suppliers now provide best value. We believe high-level supplier analysis can significantly assist with this process. So why now? It is a sad fact of life that due to the pandemic, a significant number of suppliers may no longer be around. There is a significant risk that if an overpayment is identified in a year's time, for example, this overpayment may no longer be recoverable. Again, sharing our experience, most of our clients recently have identified this as a significant risk and have actually requested a move from annual reviews to more regular, sometimes quarterly reviews in order to reduce this risk. Clearly, one of the first benefits is that overpayments are identified and recovered from suppliers, either representing an immediate cash recovery or the reduction in future payment to those suppliers. Secondly, there is the potential to look in more detail, as discussed previously, at specific areas of spend to identify opportunity for savings. The most obvious at the moment being the spend on PPE. We can all appreciate that the price of PPE has changed significantly since the beginning of the pandemic, when there was an over-demand and under-supply situation with the associated impact on prices. This should no longer be the case, but we have seen evidence that existing suppliers, should we say, have not been particularly fast in reducing their prices accordingly. Whilst most organisations are going to be experiencing the same challenges, equally the same practical solutions will be applicable. There is therefore the opportunity for organisations themselves to share best practice solutions. Without access to a crystal ball or Dominic Cummings, it is impossible to predict where the new normal will be. However, there is an opportunity for the control environment relating to payments to suppliers to be reassessed, addressing any issues found from the reviews undertaken. This can ensure that any new controls are efficient and effective at limiting future occurrences of overpayments to suppliers. Please feel free to make contact with me both during the conference and afterwards, and if you would like a copy of the presentation to share with colleagues, I'll be happy to assist. I hope that after the Q&A session you enjoyed the rest of the conference, and I thank you for your time.